tremer o chão. Amiga, agora segura minha mão. A minha jangada foi pro mar, pra minha jogada arriscar. A minha jangada foi pro mar, pra minha jogada arriscar. Eu não vou sucumbir, eu não vou sucumbir. Avisa na hora que tremer o chão. Amigo, agora segura minha mão. Você largou, 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 não tem solução. Agô, 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 é libertação. Largou, largou, não tem solução. Agô, 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 é libertação.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the amazing music. My name is Judy Wu. I'm a professor of history and Asian American studies. I also direct the UCI Humanities Center and the Center for Liberation, Anti-Racism, and Belonging. I'm so excited to be introducing our event for today. We started the Black Panther Oakland Community School Research Cluster about 3 years ago with my very good friend, Angela LeBlanc Ernst. We actually went to graduate school together. And when she first started graduate school, she had already been doing research about the Black Panthers and especially women, the Panthers. And she has just continued to build on her exciting groundbreaking research since then. I'm so happy that we have been able to collaborate with her as an independent scholar. She's provided opportunities for UCI graduate and undergraduate students to engage with her in her work. She's creating a documentary about the Oakland Community School, which is the longest running survival program of the Black Panthers. She's been creating a variety of digital resources, sharing her mass treasure trove of archival materials with our students. So I'm going to turn this program over to Angela and also to our summer interns for this year.
Thank you so much, Judy. It is a pleasure. It's been my pleasure to work with the interns at UCI, as well as the Humanities Center. Our first intern for the summer, Elliot Yu, will handle the speaker introductions.
Yes. So Angela de Levant Ernest is an independent scholar, documentarian, multimedia content creator, oral historian, and community archivist whose projects focus on 20th century social movement history, gender, education, and culture. She received a bachelor's in Afro-American Studies from Harvard University and an MA in history from Stanford University. She has spent her 30-plus year career bridging the divide between academic institutions and communities by developing and participating in projects that have public history components and incorporating narrators themselves into the process. Angela is the founding director of the OCS Project LLC, an academic research project that focuses on recovering, preserving, and sharing the oral and documentary history of the Oakland Community School, one of the Black Panther Party's educational institutions and its flagship educational programs. She consults and collaborates on a variety of projects surrounding the Black Panther Party history with both institutions and individuals. Most recently, she was a photographic and oral history consultant for Comrade Sisters, Women of the Black Panther Party, author of the book's companion guide, the Comrade Sisters, Women of the Black Panther Party Discussion and Resource Guide, and co-organizer of the Comrade Sisters book tour. She is also the recipient of the 2022 to 2023 Oral History Association and National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Ellen Cintra is a passionate teacher who has been in the field for about 20 years. Since 2011, she is a 6 to 12 public school teacher at the Secretariat of Basic Education of the Federal District in Brazil. And for the past 5 years, she has also been a teacher educator in ethnic relations. She holds an MA in education and is currently a PhD student in education at the University of Brasilia. She was a Fulbright visiting researcher at UC Riverside from 2021 to 2022, and currently investigates anti-Blackness in education, experiences, practices, and narratives of Black teachers and fugitive practices, schools, and pedagogies in Brazil and the US. Movement, community engagement, and spirituality are essential aspects of her practice and being, and she nurtures those also through Capoeira Angola, a traditional Black Brazilian sport/practice, and Candomblé Angola, an Afro-Brazilian spiritual practice. Angela, you're muted.
Thank you, Elliot. Good morning, Ellen, and welcome to the Black Panther OCS Research Cluster. I'm so excited to have you join us today because you and I only met a few years ago when you were in residence at UC Riverside as a Fulbright scholar, but we've stayed in touch even after your return to Brazil. You have a whole lifetime of experience with teaching and educating that brings you to this point. So before we begin, can you take a few minutes to share your background story with us that's led you to your practice, and also provide a bit of context for us, since you are talking about a different country, a different education system, something completely different from what we're accustomed to here in the States?
Sure, that's a pleasure. Thank you all for having me here. I'm honored to be here sharing space with you and making a space like happen throughout different countries and moments in history. So it's really beautiful to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and it's amazing to be in continued conversation with you all. So I'll share just a little bit of my background. I come from a low-income family in Brazil, in the state of São Paulo, my city. I was born in the city of Franca. We're going to talk a little bit about Brazil in a few minutes, and then we're going to be able to kind of understand what happens in Brazil in terms of racial experience and different dynamics regarding education. But I was this low-income nerd who would devour books as kind of like a way of both trying to understand the world around me and also hiding. And well, it ended up being one of my most important passions in life, like reading and understanding the world. And as I was in K-12 education, in the end of my high school years, I made a promise to myself and to other Black students that I would go back to school, so I would be able to do something better than what had been done to us. So I might call it, some people call it being stubborn, and I'm just saying that I might have always been this dreamer, and I believed we should get more and get better from institutions in general and society as a whole. So after like high school, I was always involved in volunteer work and reading to younger students. Public schools is a huge reality in the country. And after that, I decided to pursue a bachelor's in arts and language. So I went for Portuguese and English and literature. So I wrote a little bit about that when I was not kind of stopped by professors who would not really engage in Black literature or whatever Black people were talking about, their experience in the world. So I did my best to survive the system. And I actually got into university because I was a basketball player. And because we have English schools here, an English school kind of needed someone to play basketball. I went to play basketball for them, and then I got a scholarship, and that's why I studied English and then became a teacher. And because of this experience in the school, it was my first kind of encounter with different experiences of Black people around the world, because I had to kind of pay back because I had a scholarship with the basketball team stuff, but I would also have to serve some time. And I got involved in a number of books who would tell stories of Rosa Parks and Steve Biko. And it was like, whoa, there is a whole universe outside there. And why is that I'm not learning about that in regular school? So I'm a 1985 child. So back in the 2000s, I was kind of like going around Orkut. And because I was very shy too, I would try to learn in the shadows of Orkut, and that's where I really had an amazing encounter with Steve Biko's text, "I write what I want." And then I was like, there is really something happening here. And after that, I continued to like search for more opportunities to understand what was going on. And I had the first opportunity to be a Fulbrighter. I was a foreign language teaching assistant in 2009. I went to Loyola University in Chicago to teach Portuguese. And I also like investigated a few things on literature with the color purple. And that was basically what I was doing around. And after that, when I went back to Brazil in 2010, it felt like I might not be able to fit in this context anymore, because my city, Franca, is, if you want to think of whatever happens in Brazil, maybe plantation explains. And the state of São Paulo is quite cruel in like regarding that. So I needed to find other places to be, and I moved. So that's when I decided to give it a try to Brasília, which is the federal district, the capital. And I took a test to become a public school teacher here. I passed, and then I moved from São Paulo to Brasília. And I've been here since 2011, and I've been working in public schools since then, even though I've been working with education for a longer time, like since 2005, 6. And basically after that, I decided to pursue an MA in education. I was kind of like getting more involved with University of Brasília, which is a public university, one of the biggest in the country. And after my master's, I decided to pursue a PhD because I wanted to write whatever I wanted. So that's basically how like I engaged in the PhD in education here, and ended up going to UC Riverside, where I was under the supervision of Professor João Vargas. And the idea was to kind of like meet the revolution, but I'll tell you more in a few minutes.
Thank you so much for that. It was really interesting to hear you talk about starting off as a nerd who basically loved to read. That was kind of how I lived my life. You know, and I like to credit my decision to do research in history to, you know, reading all those Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys books. But there are a couple parallels because you mentioned Steve Biko. I remember they're probably like 10 or 15 years that separate us because I was born in 1970. But I remember reading Steve Biko, and I remember reading Black women's literature like The Color Purple and Anne Moody and the historical fiction, and really having a whole other world open to me. And so New Orleans started feeling small to me after a certain point. So thank you for sharing that. Can you just spend a little bit of time for us? I know you have a few slides to share with us to give us that context that you referred to earlier.
Definitely, that will be a pleasure. Let me just open it up here. So it's really interesting, like how we can maybe understand the world through Black lenses. And when we think of the diaspora and the connections we are making throughout it, we should look at the history of amazing reclaiming practices and insurgencies, but also how anti-Blackness has kind of like organized our world. So we have to resist and fight, for example. Let me just, here. So I first thought of maybe we could take a look at what it means to be like what does that mean to think of Brazil? So just as a starter, I wanted you guys to engage in this here and tell me what words come to your mind when you think, or when you hear the word Brazil. It could be like a picture or a word. And I would like you guys to type that in the chat. So what I'll do is like, I'll count to 5, like backwards. And when I say go, you type whatever comes to your mind. Is that okay? So 5, 4, 3, 2, go. What is that come to your mind when you think of Brazil? Over here. Let me see. As you're typing, we can see a kind of like upside down map of the world. That's just kind of like to start a provocation. What have you heard of Brazil? Maybe Angela, if you want to open your mic, if you feel comfortable, tell me anything.
I see huge, favelas, Amazon, favelas again.
Thank you so much. So yes, that's basically what we think of when we think of Brazil in general terms, and that's a lot of what I hear when I'm thinking about Brazil. So the experience is much more than that, but maybe it's an invitation to think like how the world has been portraying such a huge country. We're about 215 million people at this moment, at this time. And what is going on is that we have a different distribution of population. So when you look at, for example, we have 9% of Blacks and 47% of Browns. Why is that when we think of Brazil, we are also connecting that to so much violence? Because like we do have a romantic experience maybe when we think about favelas, which are like in general terms slums. But why is that they have been portrayed so much? Or sometimes, like when we think about huge, why is that we're connecting such a huge country to experiences and stories or narratives of poverty, impoverishment, or maybe like what parts of the history is not like being shown? Or sometimes what I hear is like people connecting that to samba, which is an amazing part of our culture. But what else is there? Why is that we may be portraying like the 0.5 kind of percentage of indigenous people in unrealistic terms, and we're not talking about the struggles which have reduced them to such a low number in the country. Considering Brazil was kind of invaded in the 1500s, that's when they report the first arrival of the Portuguese colonizers here. We had the whole country, like this entire country was just populated by millions of indigenous people. And Brazil is one of the hugest destinations for the enslaved population of African descent, which means about 13 million, 11 to 13 million enslaved Africans were brought here. So there is a reason why we have such a mixed population. And just so you understand why we have this 5 descriptors on the screen, is that's how our census collects data on the people in the country. So we are a majority of Blacks, of people. We call them, in Portuguese, we call them negros, which is the category of Blacks and Browns all together. And we use that so we can better design public policies to kind of achieve the needs and the rights of these groups. But still, we have like the population, which is considerably mixed, and we're trying to kind of understand why is that we have such low recognition in terms of Black descendants or African-American descendants, I'm sorry, Afro-Brazilian descendants in the country. And there are a number of reasons for that. So thinking of context, I brought this first picture here, which is a book which I love. It's Angola Janga, that's the name. And Angola Janga was another name for Quilombo dos Palmares, which is one of our biggest Maroon communities. There are the dates, like from when it existed, it varies, but some reports say it started kind of like around 1592 and it lasted until 1716. I'll tell you more about what Maroon communities are later on, but basically they are like groups of enslaved people who ran away. They were fugitives, and they formed communities in different parts of the country. In general, they were trying to hide and seeking for better life conditions, because they were kind of like, when they were not running away or reorganizing, they were deliberately, you got me.
Deliberately.
Thank you. You got it. Resisting. So they would they would run away, but they would also, they would rather die than be enslaved. And this is a beautiful comic book because it tells the story. And Marcelo de Salete, who's the author, he has a series of books that tells that story through cartoons. Another thing when we think about like general terms and timelines is the types of revolts. We had dozens of revolts in the country, and they are generally not we don't really talk about them. One of our biggest revolts is Revolta dos Malês, which happened in Salvador, Bahia, which is the blackest city in the country, Salvador, in the state of Bahia. And it happened in 1835. Basically, they insurged and they set fire and like throughout the city. And interestingly enough, they were the kind of like last group to be brought here, the Malês, and they were connected to, they were Muslims of Muslim descent, Africans of Muslim descent, so which means they were able to read, and that was one of the strategies that was most helpful for them to organize in the country. At the same time, in the United States, we had the reading kind of like groups, which were organized in the literate collectives, which also have people from the same descendants organizing throughout reading. So reading has been a very important strategy here. When we think about like a number of timelines, we're going to think also that as one of the last countries to abolish slavery, we needed, the country was kind of forced to abolish slavery because it was kind of causing damage to trade. So slave trade, they started a prohibition in 1850 with the Lei Eusébio de Queiroz, the law Eusébio de Queiroz, but it didn't really happen. Slavery was only abolished in the country in 1888. In the United States, it happened much earlier. And we indeed have like other ways of organizing in the country. For example, something which is not usually talked about is that we had a Black school in the country, which was running in like around 1854. And Professor Pretestato Passo Silva was the teacher there. We only found about that, the history, because when some researchers were looking through the archives, they found kind of evidence of Black people asking the government to keep the school so Black children would be able to be educated in general terms. The school unfortunately was closed, and we have little material, which are kind of like we're checking the archives to see how much we can find about that. But when we think of education, we're connecting a number of laws who would kind of force the state, like Lei do Ventre Livre, which is a law which was passed in 1871 and forced the government to free children from enslaved women. It didn't really happen, because the government, of course, in general in Brazil, what happens is like you have laws being passed, but the government finding ways to go over them. So the government would have like a timeline of 20 years to really free those enslaved children. So in the end of the day, they were still enslaved for 20 years more. And that's what has basically happened throughout the country. In the 1900s, what's going to happen after the abolition of slavery is the country, because of because of the way race had been discussed around the world, we're going to have something which was called the myth of racial democracy, which sets the scenery in Brazil. And that means that the country, as in other parts of the globe, they were trying whitening policies and strategies because they thought the Black population was a problem. So I'm using the first picture, like Cam's Redemption, which is a painting by Modesto Brocos. It's from 1895. And what it's showing is that by miscegenation, so by having Black people be together or marry and form families with white people, they would be able to whiten the country. And that was something, the strategy the government was using was to bring immigrants to the country, like Italian, Japanese, Portuguese, people from all over the country. We do have like the context of wars here also as a setup, as a background kind of a thing. And they were trying to kind of like erase the Black population from the country. This scenery, the idea of whitening being the salvation, is what Modesto Brocos is trying to express. As you can see, like the Black grandmother and then her daughter with a lighter skinned kid is basically what the country was trying to work around. And that idea of Brazil as a racial paradise has been set from these arrangements. So Black people, or the Black population as a problem, who had to be erased so the country could advance. With this narrative, they also kind of, because we were a majority, we were about in 1895, we were about 80% of the population in terms of Black population. So if we followed what was going on in the Americas, like in Haiti, the country would be set on fire. They would have to find strategies to both erase the population, but also take these people out of the urban centers, and they would be either incarcerated or killed, but they would have to be kind of like vanished. So that's how the slums, for example, were created, because after abolition, we did not really have any policies that would kind of foster any dignity or like guaranteed human rights or anything like that, because they wanted us to be erased. So they forged the narrative, as they were not really able to kind of like make the Black population disappear. A number of different writings came up as selling Brazil as a racial democracy, which means that they were selling narratives and writing about that as if the Black population, the Portuguese colonizers and the indigenous people were three aspects and key aspects of harmonious culture who would live in peace and together. And they kind of like, when they saw the first plan didn't really work out, that's the narrative they were trying to find. Of course, with police force and brutality in general terms. And then I'm showing a few pictures of different organizations which were fighting the structure. And the most prominent, I'm going to say, is one of the most prominent, I'm going to say, is Frente Negra Brasileira, the Black Brazilian Front, which lasted for basically 6 years. It started as an organization, which is something really common in our country. We have Black communities getting together through samba schools, like a number of cultural manifestations which are rooted in Black culture and African culture in general. And Frente Negra Brasileira started as a kind of like forming communities, and then it ended up like becoming a party, which was erased from the country as well. Leaders were killed, they disappeared, and a number of things. And that kind of coincides, which I'll share next, which is a period of dictatorship in the country. Another initiative we have here, which was huge, was the Black Experimental Theater, Teatro Experimental do Negro, which kind of like organized around the 1940s. And in the context, we're talking about a context of wars, and Black people were also resisting and strategizing, considering what was going around in the globe. So generally speaking, what we have is a long period of dictatorship, which starts in the 60s, which not coincidentally is around the same time when a number of different groups are organizing through the civil rights movement and reclaiming their rights. It lasts for about 20 years in the country. And in the 1980s, we have the Black Unified Movement, which lasts until now, has been silenced for a long period because of the dictatorship. And then in the 80s, it came back like stronger. And it still has a great presence and a very important influence in the ways we have been organizing. So Black mobilization and Black strategizing and different ways of reclaiming our rights has really had a huge impact in Brazilian Constitution, which is the last review kind of a thing we have is from 1988. And it has like a very big impact on the laws which have been passed later on, which is we have 3 different laws from 2003, 2008, and 2011, which both kind of force schools and education in general to tell the stories of Black Afro-Brazilians in general and indigenous peoples. And also that set the context for the quota system, which was nationally and like taken in 2011 in the federal and public universities or institutions of higher education. So this is just a little bit of context, so you see where we're coming from, and there are different connections, both like in Brazil and the United States, but also throughout the Black diaspora, I would say.
Here, I'm just trying to get my screen straight. I want to thank you, Ellen, for giving us that brief setup for the historical and cultural context of Brazilian history. That concept of intentional erasure is fascinating to me. Yet you talk about the ways that Black people fought against that to preserve their lives, literally, culturally, politically, like there's constant, it's almost as if there were constant revolutions within, right, within the system, even on smaller scales, because just those very acts of fighting back, you know, were revolutionary. Can you talk about how maroons and marooning fit that narrative and how it's connected to your specific research?
Yeah, sure. What happens is like when we think about maroon communities, and there are a number of different interpretations for that, I'll share mine with you. When we think of maroon communities as these Black spaces or spaces which are forged by the resistance of the Black population, both in terms of running away from plantations and the chattel slavery system and like running into the forest or into the nature just so they would form and rearrange their communities and leave. Like, even though they had been like people, Africans who had been coming from a number of different countries or reigns or communities in Africa, they would find ways, common ways to organize, and forming community is their basis, which means this shared collective knowledge on resistance strategy, but also technologies of survival, be them like agricultural or engineering or kind of like negotiating. So this imaginary of being in need of other Black people to resist and forge their or reimagine their own world in a different context is kind of, I would say, the essence of what Maroon communities are. Up to the date, we have hundreds of Maroon communities in the country still. And what is interesting is like, this idea of organizing around quilombos is not something that happens only in terms of runaway enslaved people who would forge communities, but also the ways Black people found to organize within the urban centers, for example, or resist. For example, when we think about cultural traditions, we generally we might place them in the general umbrella of culture. When we think of the way capoeira, which is basically a sport, I'll generally call it that, but it's more than that. The way we have organized, the way we show respect, or like this idea of horizontal organization, which is organic and have their own principles and politics, is something that happens into a number of different groups. When we think of like the presence of marooning or the importance of marooning to capoeira groups, or maybe to samba schools, samba communities. Samba is something which is really kind of like worldwide, a notion which is mentioned worldwide or admired somehow. But samba schools, they are born because of the resistance of Black communities who would forge their own dances and cultures and ways of taking care of each other, celebrating life, and resisting through music, through dance, through culture, through forming community, through taking care of each other, through educating each other. And that's something which is common in different expressions of Brazilian culture. So the fact that we have like a circular kind of way of thinking, the fact that we have to, in these communities, we communicate to elderly, not in a position of like general hierarchy as we see in white supremacy, but no, it's like about learning from your elders so your community can keep on going. That's the principle of capoeira. That's the principle of samba schools. That's the principle of candomblés, which is Afro-Brazilian religious tradition. So this idea of being in community and forging your own educational processes is basically what is behind the idea of marooning, I would say. And when I look at that, what happens is when we think of education for the Black population, and that's how it shows in my research project, is like when we think of education, we're thinking about something else, which is not what the world has forged and imposed as education, because we have other principles and other ways of organizing and being in relation to each other. So first and foremost, the idea of community and learning from the elderly, is central. There's our, like in that term, oral tradition is a must. So that's how our communities have basically survived. Unfortunately, we do not have like a number of when we think of how Christianity has unfortunately portrayed or the Black population and Afro-Brazilian religious traditions, we see a lot of violence, which is in communication with the idea of nation state kind of a thing. And but what I learned from that in my study is that education for us has never been kind of like forged first by the imaginary of regular or what regular education means. And when we think about Maroon communities as they are up to date, we also think they have like their own ways of organizing their own curriculum, even though they have a curriculum which is parallel to the mandatory national curriculum. They do have their own curriculum, just like the indigenous communities and stuff. So they have reclaimed their rights for education on their own terms. And that's what happens in different organizations, like Black organizations.
So with their curriculum development and how the Maroon communities view education, kind of from the inside out, not allowing the outside perspective to be imposed, how would you say that that is a response to anti-Blackness in the way it showed up in kind of traditional Brazilian education? Or do you think it was something that organically came about? And then I'll give you another question. How then do you fold that kind of insular practice? How do you connect that to an institution like the Oakland Community School? What led you to explore the Oakland Community School's approach to educating youth here in the United States?
What I find like amazing is that when we think about Black communities, we are also forging not only the language we're using to educate each other, or for example, but the principle, one common principle I see, and especially in Maroon communities, is like the idea of like maybe each one teach one. So, which means that I will have to learn from somebody who's maybe not in the same grade, but still has a lot to tell me. And it's not only about, like, for example, reading and writing, but also how I can use reading and writing to understand the world. That has happened in the schools which were born in the tradition of Candomblés, which is, we have like this amazing school on Eugênia in Salvador. It was born in Terreiro de Candomblé, which is this space for religious practice, but it means that the ones who knew more would go back into the community to take care of the community and help like them become both literate, and critical of whatever was happening outside. And by doing so, they were using, for example, the Orisha's mythology to talk about principles, to talk about human rights, to talk about health and preserving the traditions. So that's not something which is separable. When we think about Brazilian education, for example, it's no coincidence. We have mandatory education up until around 17, like students are about 17 years old. That's mandatory kind of a thing. It's really mandatory up until the point they are in the 9th grade. We have like from like 1st to 5th, it's the first like primary education, then 6th to 9th, and then we have high school 1st to 3rd. Black students or Black youth, especially males, they are kind of like expelled from school in huge rates. And at the same, like, that's how I see anti-Blackness showing in education, for example. As they are expelled in around like 70% more than white students or non-Black students, I would say. These 70% from like the 15 years of age until 24 kind of a thing, that's the time they should be in schools. They are being killed by the state. And that's one of the most critical aspects of anti-Blackness showing in terms of violence finding Black bodies, especially Black youth male bodies. What our communities have done is like they have found the strategies to either kind of like replace and take these students into taking care of their own communities, or maybe finding like remedial programs, or having them place value in other ways of education, so they would be able to either prepare for the market or something like that. But the communities have been able to kind of teach the students on their own terms. So I can see connections, for example, when we think about students going back to analyzing like if another student, what this student has made was a mistake, was good or bad for the community. that's a principle that we can see happening in Candomblé scenarios. We can see them happening Maroon communities. Some schools do use that as a strategy. So these are a number of connections. So the presence of the community in the school and the ways they find to like kind of mediate knowledge and transfer or share knowledge, they're pretty similar.
Curious. So first, when you describe the Black males and how they, experience such violence and, basically get removed from schools and put in prisons, that's something that is explored here as well. The school to prisons pipeline that some would argue in some spaces have started as early as kindergarten, and it's not just Black males, it's also, all Black people. So I think I find that an interesting parallel. What I wonder is, what impact do you want your research to have on the communities you study? You started off your bio for us talking about your background and your promise to go back to community. So what is it that you think your work or hope your work will do for the communities that you study?
I think that also connects to the fact that I'm still a dreamer. So even though I'm a public school teacher, which means I work for the state, and like that's the way I have been able to fight from within, what I really want to share back, especially, for example, by sharing what I've learned from the Oakland Community School, or what I've learned from other educational communities like the Malcolm X Academy, who has been modeling after the Oakland Community School, or given their best like to foster this way of forming community and educating our own. What I would say is like understanding that there is kind of a game which is being played, or I don't know, I would say it's kind of like a game. When I wrote that, I was like thinking, is that really a game? Isn't that the original project? But when we think about formal education, the way it has been served and designed, and the way it has been finding our youth, finding our kids, finding our Black kids, it's just to kind of annihilating them. So when my presence in public schools, for example, is one of kind of discussing that there are a number of things we have been losing in terms of students and technologies, like Black technologies, diasporic technologies, we are not been able to kind of foster through basic public education, and we should be familiar of those. So my intention is to share them, because when we think of public education in Brazil, that's where we have the majority of the population, like Black population in. So I think it's really important that we do understand that we have a history of honor and greatness that schools should be becoming responsible of. But at the same time, when I go back to school, is also to say that this system has been failing us intentionally, and like maybe kind of sharing that there are no promises which are really that the state's going to really live up to in terms of what has happened to the Black communities. And I think we should be aware of that, because there are a number of pacts that we're going to maybe choose to abide, but maybe understand that there could be a choice. And maybe, and honestly, when I look at the Oakland Community School and how like it has impact and shift the communities and fostered a number of possibilities, or when I see other Black schools like Maria Filipa in Salvador, or maybe the Reage School, Winnie Mandela, which is one of like an organization here in Brazil, what I see is that they are playing out of the system sometimes. Even when they are kind of like trying to get into the system, they are also describing another way of looking at the Black population, which is not what the state is abiding to. And we should be really aware of that. So when I think of my practice or my research, that's what I'm committing to. Maybe forging and or making space to revolution and critical thinking, and kind of really honoring our ancestors and the ways we have been doing and organizing.
I love that. Thank you. I have, of course, you know, I have many more questions for you, but we've reached the point where we need to open to audience questions. And we actually do have one question. And for this section, I'd like to ask that our intern, Michaela, share the questions. Thank you, Michaela.
Hello. Okay, so the first question that we have is, are you familiar with Afro-Latinas and their open university? And if so, has the free open university made a significant impact on the empowerment of Black women and queer folk in Brazil?
Thank you for the question. Who sent that question, by the way?
Navi or Navy Husky.
Navy Husky. Yeah,
Thank
Navy
you.
was one of our first, she was in our first cohort of interns 2021.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. That's a powerful question. It's an amazing one, by the way. So yes, I am. Afro-Latinas, well, so you understand the context. We have a festival here. It started in Brasília. It's we call it Festival Latinidades. And it was kind of a celebration for Black women. It usually ran into the week of July 25th, which is the day of Afro-Brazilian and Caribbean Black women. So we were celebrating Black women's ancestry. And what has happened, it's been more than a decade of celebrations. Jaqueline and a huge number of amazing Black intellectuals and activists, female ones, they have been bringing into the capital, and now it has moved to other cities in the country. Just this year, they are in São Paulo, Salvador, and other cities. And they have been celebrating like the most prominent and challenging perspectives of Black women in Brazil, and they are celebrating those narratives. Also, Black women in Latin America. And now as they open the university, it means that they are offering mostly free courses and classes to empower those women to better strategize in terms of sharing their narratives, getting more ready or prepared to kind of, I would say like fight in the open market, so to speak, because we're talking about like fighting and just something else. But it's also about women learning from other women how to better strategize, form community, and think critically about like kind of maybe gendered anti-Blackness has operated against them. It's really about insurgency. And I think they're following the steps of a number of Black intellectuals who have kind of led the way in the country, like maybe Lúcia Xavier. We're thinking about Beatriz Nascimento, Lélia Gonzalez, who are great intellectuals who kind of like have set the open, like maybe the paths for us here. So yes, it's becoming something beautiful to participate and take part of. It's amazing. I don't know if I've answered the question, but yeah.
I think you did. I think it's very, it sort of brings a lot of hope when communities sort of intertwine for the same goal. So that was very nice to actually hear. And I'm glad that those things are happening all over the place. The next question we have was, when did you know that you needed to do a comparative study of education in Brazil and the US?
So I was, well, there's something which has kind of like connected me to maybe the United States, which is first the language, but also music. It has always touched my soul in different ways. But when I first went to the United States, and not actually when I first went to the United States, but when I first saw the movie The Color Purple, I was like a very young girl. I was about like 7 years old or 8, something like that. I don't remember. And because we were talking about these narratives of violence against Black women in general, I saw a number of connections, which made me think like there is something really wrong going around the world. So if it's really happening like to Black girls in other countries, so there must be other stories that should be kind of like told. When I first went to the United States in 2009 to Loyola University in Chicago, I took an African American literature class, because I have always liked literature. And that made me think that the narratives that had been told in other countries like the United States, they were way too similar to the stories and narratives our Black writers had been writing here. At the time, I didn't know that much of literature, like Black women's literature in Brazil, but I was already familiar with Carolina Maria de Jesus. And there is another book I'm missing right now, but I had read Ursula, which is a classic in terms of talking about slavery. I had read at the undergrad studies. And I was like, there are way too many points which connect. When I was an intern because of the basketball kind of scholarship kind of a thing, and I saw the stories, I was like, I know Rosa Parks was a huge figure and like a very important person, but I remember my mother telling me that she would not do a few things. Or like, even though my mom does not really have this personality of like fighting back, but she would find other ways to resist. And I was like, there is way too much in common. And at this last visit, this last moment I was in the United States, as I was looking into education, I saw a number of like similarities. And when I learned about the Oakland Community School, like in 2021, a friend was sharing the history with me. I was like, yes, like when we think of diaspora, like a number of different processes, we're talking about relationality.
I'm also a believer that one thing that connects us all is our stories, as unfortunate as it may be sometimes, but
Yeah.
that's the one thing that, if anything, will bring us together is the similarities and the recognition that we have in our stories. But that was a very interesting perspective, like just seeing the connections all over the diaspora. But our next question says, we love you, Ellen, from Malcolm X Academy. We would like to ask what you think is the most important thing we can do in regards to teaching African children to understand our interconnectedness right now, given the political climate globally.
Well, I think that the more we learn about different ways Black people have organized around the globe, the better it is and the strongest we get, I would say. So, Jordan, thank you for the question. Miss you badly. And when I think about, for example, the way we might be able to share stories of resistance and strategizing, I think the more, the easier it gets for our people to get even more creative, because we are truly brilliant. But for example, when I learned that Black people are using their bodies to both take care of themselves, like when I think of capoeira, and I'm saying like capoeira all the time because that's something that really centers me, not only because it pieces my mind, but it's because it helps me kind of understand how my body is seen and how I can use my body to kind of play with that in a way which is I'm setting the boundaries and I'm bringing in my ancestrality into the conversation, so our bodies can move in my beat and not into other people's beat. So I would say like sharing stories, like being in conversation with people from the continent, definitely. Reading about education, for example, we have Amilcar Cabral, who's like the pedagogue of the revolution. So that's the type of mind we should kind of like understand, so we can think about educational processes which are centering more on the struggles of Black people and being in community and communication. So yes, I think the more we talk, the better it is.
Thank you so much for that. I couldn't agree more, honestly. But that was all the time that we had for questions. So I'm going to pass it now to my other fellow, Gabby, for our closing announcement.
Thank you so much, Michaela. You're such a great facilitator for Q&As. Thank you, Ellen, so much for such a wonderful and informative and really inspiring presentation. And to all our audience members for your really thoughtful questions and your attendance of today's webinar. Please join the Black Panther Oakland Community School Research Cluster for our Summer Fellow Showcase on August 28th at 10 a.m. And it will be at the UC Irvine campus in the Humanities Gateway, room 1010. Myself, Michaela, Johnny, and Elliot will be talking about the work we've done this summer for the research cluster and our experiences with Angela and contributing to this amazing project. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a lovely week.
Thank you, Ellen. We'll see you in a few on the other side.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming and showing up. Thank you.